Hello everybody. Few weeks ago I was asked to speak on Romans 10:15, and I'm not going to take that verse in particular right now, but I'm going to take the verses around it from Romans 10:12 on to 15, and this is where Paul says, if anyone who calls on the name of the Lord Jesus Christ will be saved and will find salvation. And after that he goes on and he goes through a series of reasons why people are not calling on the name of Jesus Christ. And this is how his reasoning goes. He says, how can they call on him if they do not believe in him? How can they believe if they have not heard? How can they hear if it is not preached? And how can people preach if they're not sent? Verse 15 says, how can they preach if they're not sent? And just thinking about that, it was a completely different reasoning than I had, and a very different way of putting things. A lot of, actually, I've spoken messages, and a lot of messages that we hear, they would say, okay, people are not hearing the gospel because you are not going. And we're pointing the finger more at our personal lack of doing something. Well, Paul is pointing the finger at, well, we're not sending anybody. And so how does that work? I was thinking, like, what in the world does he mean? And so obviously we cannot force anybody to go and preach the gospel, so that's not what he means. And so finally I came to the point of thinking, okay, well, what he means is we need to cultivate a heart of missions within the church. So how do we do that? That's what my message is about. And how do we cultivate a heart for missions in the church? How can we make people focus on missions in a way that they will want to go and they will be sent because of it? So we're not doing the greatest job at sending out missionaries and reaching to the, let's say the 1040 window and all these areas. And part of the reason is that the heart for missions is not really there. So what are a few things that you can do in your family? What are things that we can do as a church that will cultivate this heart of missions, that we would be sending out people more? I think the very first thing that we need to do is we need to believe in the importance of the message that we need to bring to people. Without this message, they are going to hell. Without this message, they have no hope to go to heaven. So if we do not bring this message to them, there's just no hope. So the good news is such good news because it comes in the middle of really bad news. That's when the best news comes, is when something horrible has happened and all of a sudden someone brings good news, and then it's really good news. So that's what this good news is about. We're in a world that's dying, most people going to hell, and unless we believe that, we will have no motivation to go out and tell them about Jesus. So the very first thing I think that the verse 15 will tell us is, how beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news. Now, I'm not much of a poet. That doesn't really do much to me, but I do understand that in the culture, I know that in the polyculture, the feet is something very dirty. You do not touch anybody with your feet. You kind of hide your feet. You don't point your feet towards anybody. Well, this verse is saying that even down to the feet, the person who brings good news, the evangelist, the person who's telling people about the love of Jesus, down to his feet, he is beautiful. So it basically is saying, this is the most valuable job you can do in life. There is no job that's compared to it. There is nothing worthwhile in this world more than, okay, so everything has its own place, but there's nothing more valuable than to tell people about Jesus and to save them from eternal hell. I mean, I don't know if you can think of anything more important. There isn't. There's nothing you can do in this world that will last longer. Anything you do in this world will just die in this world. Even, I'm really into mercy ministries. I think we need to serve people physically. I do a lot of that. But even that is going to die here. It's just helping them for the now. there is nothing like bringing someone to Christ. That is something that's going to be long-lasting, that has an amazing value. It was so valuable to save lives that Jesus was happy to go on the cross for it, to see the joy of those who will be saved. So, first of all, if we do not stress the value of this message and the importance of it in our churches, this heart for missions will not be cultivated. So we really need to make the message and evangelism a focus in our churches. A few practical things we can do to cultivate that heart of missions in our children and in the church as a whole. Matthew 9:35-38, Jesus, this is talking about Jesus, and it says, Jesus went through all the towns and villages, teaching in their synagogues, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom, healing every disease and sickness. When he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. Then he said to his disciples, "The harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Ask the Lord of the harvest, therefore, to send out workers into the harvest field." There's several things, key things I see here. I want to take the example of Jesus, obviously, because Jesus cultivated a heart for missions in his disciples. All 12 of them. Obviously, one of them died hanging, Judas, but all 12. The next one was chosen to take his place, and all 12 of them died while they were serving and evangelizing. They were crucified. They were, had their heads cut off, and all this. So obviously, he did a good job to transfer his passion for mission into his disciples. Now, how did he do that? Before I go into some other things, I want to say this is what he said specifically to do about the problem. He said the harvest is plentiful, so that means the world is ready to hear the gospel, but the workers are few. And so what did he say at that point? He didn't say go into all the world. He says that later, obviously. That's part of what we need to do. But he said, pray therefore for the Lord, to the Lord of the harvest, that he would send workers. That's the very first thing we need to do, is pray. As a church and as a family, we need to take different regions and different things that we hear about, and we need to pray that God will intervene in those problems in the world and send people to preach the good news. I believe prayer is the very first step. I think when you pray, you start to focus on different things, and just praying about it cultivates a heart of missions in your heart. So it changes you, and it will make you willing to go yourself eventually. If you're a prayerful person, if you keep on focusing on different things and praying about it and saying, God, would you please deal with this issue in our village, with these people that are really hurting, and send people amongst them. I think if you pray that way, eventually you're going to become willing to go, and not necessarily that God will want you to go. I'll get to that later. But prayer is the very first step. So prayer brings something to your mind. It exposes you to the problem. In order to pray, you have to see the problem. It says in the verse that we just read, it said that Jesus looked at the people and had compassion on them, and because he saw the problems they were dealing with. And I just want to say, we need to be able to look out and see the problems there are in this world, because this is not a pretty world. There are all kinds of troubles. The amount of suicides, the hurts and deep pains of children and men and women who have been divorced, and just all kinds of anger and abuse, and just if you look at trafficking, how many people don't even have drinking water, don't have toilets? I mean, just physical and spiritual. There's needs all over this world, and Jesus saw those needs, and he said, now pray for them. So the church, the very first thing the church needs to do is pray. When we hear of something on the news, the pastors need to bring it into church and say, hey, let's pray for this. Let's pray that God will send people there. And when we do that, God will start working in our hearts. And if he wants us to send us, we will start being ready. That's the first step. The second thing we need to do, so pray is the first. Expose people to the problems of the world. That's the second thing that we need to do. Now, prayer is exposure to the problems. When you pray, you're being exposed to the problems. If you talk about the persecuted church in certain regions, that's exposure, and it's showing people the needs of outside their church. I'll give you an example. Just the past few months, there's been all that stuff going on in the Ukraine. And as I take my children to school, I turn on the radio and I listen to this about the Ukraine. And just having exposure to what's going on in the Ukraine, automatically I started praying. Say, God, you really need to bring peace in that country. You need to give wisdom to the new leadership. You need to bring peace, help conflict not to come, and send people out there to do your work. And so automatically exposure to the problem brought this prayer, got me to pray for Ukraine. A few weeks later, there was March break, and we had to travel a bit, and we didn't listen to the radio, so Ukraine was no longer on my mind. And all of a sudden, I'm not praying anymore for it. So exposure is extremely important for us to have a heart for areas and to see the problems around us. We really need to push ourselves to be exposed to it. So the church needs to expose the people in the church of the problems around them, and not just by words. The church needs to expose the problems in the community and go out and do something about it. Take the members and go out and do something, even if it's a minor thing. That's what Jesus did. Jesus exposed his disciples to the world around them, so they weren't locked up in a little church. They went out. They went to village. They saw the needs. They dealt with the needs as they could. There's only a certain amount you can do. We don't have to do everything, but we have to do what we can. And so, exposure, that's what Jesus did. He exposed the disciples to the world around them. We need to expose the church people, our children, to the world, to the needs around them. We can't have them in a little shell, in our little lovely little home. We need to get them out. Exposure in words and prayer, exposure in action, to whatever degree that is. It starts small, but you're getting people out, getting people to experience things, and that's cultivating a heart in them. Another thing that we see is Jesus had passion on the people. He had great passion, and it shows all throughout the New Testament. Jesus sees people and he has passion on them. And one of the stories I really like is when Jesus and the disciples have been ministering and teaching and being with people for many days, and Jesus is tired and his disciples are tired, and Jesus says, come on, let's get in the boat, cross the river, cross the lake. And so they get in the boat, they cross the lake, they're trying to get away and get some rest. And the people see him where he's going, and so they run around the lake and they meet him. And so he gets over there and he wants rest. But here there's this huge crowd shows up, and it says, and he doesn't oh no man, not these guys again. He has compassion on the people again. So Jesus has this passionate heart for people, this real love and for people. We need to cultivate this passion for people. Passion transfers from one person to the other. That's why groups of friends will become passionate about different things, skating or skiing, because one person's passion will transfer to someone else's, and the group's passion becomes, whoever hangs out with that group will start being passionate. And the church needs to be passionate about people and loving them and serving them. Do we have passion to serve people? Is it a real priority in our life to preach the gospel and to serve others? I just want to ask this question. I don't want to be negative and all that. I'm just wondering how many of us have the desire and the ambition that our children would become missionaries or servants, or that they would go and serve people. It was a passion for Jesus, and he wanted his disciples to do that. And like I said, the message is so important, that work is so important according to the Bible. It's based, that's what the Bible is all about, Jesus dying on the cross for these people, we being a part of the Great Commission. If we call it the Great Commission, if it is so great, how passionate are we to want to be a part of it? How is that seen in our churches? How is it seen in your and my life? Passion will transfer, and your children will see what you're passionate about. The last thing the church needs to do is approach people in the church and to ask them if they would serve, and to ask them if they would be missionaries. This could be seen in the book of Acts, where the church approached 7 people in chapter 6. The disciples were so busy preaching, praying, and they were so busy with widows and orphans and taking care of the poor that they no longer had so much time to preach and do the things that they were called to do. So they gather around and they approach 7 people and they say, would you please serve the poor? And so they take these 7 people and they pray for them, they lay their hands on them, and these 7 people, I want you to notice, they're not going out into missions. These are 7 people. They're staying at home and they're ministering to the poor right there in Jerusalem. So setting apart, approaching people. Hey, the pastor could approach a family and say, listen, there's this widow, she barely has any food. There's this kid begging on the street, or this widow down the street. Could you just feed her? Could you just keep an eye out on her? Could you take her to the hospital when she needs to? So approaching people in the church with small things they could do, getting them involved in the lives of others. That's what Jesus did. The church needs to the pastors need to look into the lives of the people and see what kind of ministry God has for them and approach them for it. The second thing here is book of Acts 13, 1-3. We see that the church is praying and God says, okay, I want you to send Barnabas and Paul, who was Saul at that point. So they took Barnabas, Saul, and they said, do you want to go out to missions? Yeah. So they lay their hands, pray for them, and send them out. So we need to give people the opportunity to serve. We need to approach them to serve. We need to be serving to start out with, and then it will transfer on, and this heart of missions will go on into the lives of the people in the church and our children. I just want to give an example, and I've given the example of my grandfather many times in many places, but I just love that example because it, many of us, when we think of missions, when we think of serving God, we automatically jump up to either a huge preacher, a TV preacher, or just a huge evangelist guy who can speak well and all that, or we go right to Mother Teresa type, take care of 1,000 people. I don't know, we jump right to extreme missions, let's say. And I don't believe that everybody in the church is called for that. I believe that a large portion, just let's say for the book of Acts, 7 people were given the job of home missions to serve the community, and 2 people were sent out into the world. I think many of us are just normal people, and we think, serving God means to be abnormal or just amazing, smart and all that, but that's not the truth. So I want to give you just an example of my grandfather. The first thing when I was preparing this message, I thought of my grandfather because my grandfather's 4 children, including my father, became missionaries or were active in missions, and lots of their grandchildren became active in missions. And I was wondering, what did my grandfather do to give that heart to his children? He never was a missionary. My grandfather never gave messages. He wasn't the pastor. He wasn't the leader in the church as far as seen in the front. He was the leader in the back. And so he doesn't fit this picture of what we think a missionary would be. He wasn't a missionary as far as going out into the world, baptizing, all that stuff. But my grandfather was faithful to the church. He was strict. His generations were strict, but really faithful to the church. But one thing about my grandfather is that he had missionaries in his home all the time. He did whatever he could to help. and he would help them physically. Like, he'd give them cars. He'd have extra car around the farm. He would give it to them to use. They could use the farmhouse to stay. He would feed them. He would just really honor these people. And his heart was completely mission, although he was not completely active in the way we think active means. But he was praying for missions. He was giving more than 10% to missions. And this heart for missions that he had, even though he was not out there in the front, was transferred into his children, and they became missionaries. So he did something right. What he did right was these things that we've been talking about. He prayed for missions. He was active as he could, as God wanted him to be active in missions. That didn't mean for him to leave the country. He stayed on his farm. He was a farmer, and he worked an office job in a factory all his life. So, but he was active, involved in helping whoever was around him. Didn't matter what the need was, he was there to help. If it was to help move or help this or that. So he was involved in the community, loving people, praying. He was giving towards mission. He valued missions a lot, even though he was not a missionary himself. And so all these things that we've seen were real, were true in his life, and his children were affected by it. And so he really did send out preachers, and he didn't have to force them. So in the end, I just want you to think about, how passionate are you for missions? Is it something that you are really, do you understand, and do you think about how important the messages we are to give to the world? And is it a focus in your life? And we can think about that, how important it is. We can pray more. A very specific thing Jesus said to do is pray. And I think that when we start praying, God will change our hearts and will prepare some of us to go. I just wonder why there aren't more people that are going to be missionaries. I mean, really, very, very few people want to be missionaries. I'm just wondering why. And I think that, prayer will take us to the point where we will eventually be willing to say, hey, I'm ready to go if you want me to go. And that's the first step. And then, like we said, the other steps as well. We need to be active in the lives of people around us to understand and see the problems they have, be active in helping them. And so home missions, loving people, and having a passion for people. And if you have those things in your life, I think God will be able to use you. I hope this message helped in a little way.